5 years before a single shot was fired in the American Revolution, a man died in the streets of Boston for the idea of American freedom. His name was Crispus Attucks. He was of African and indigenous descent, a dock worker, and on March 5, 1770, he became the first person killed in what would become known as the Boston Massacre. British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of colonists protesting British rule, and Crispus Attucks fell first. Historians widely consider him the first casualty of the American Revolution, a man who died for a nation's freedom 5 years before that nation existed, and decades before that freedom would even partially extend to people who looked like him. This is where the story of Black America's relationship to American independence actually begins, not as a footnote. As the opening scene. When the Revolutionary War began in earnest, thousands of black men made a choice that history rarely asks you to sit with. They fought. Historians estimate more than 5,000 black soldiers served in the Continental Army and in state militias throughout the war. Some already free, some promised freedom in exchange for service, all of them fighting for the founding of a nation whose own founding documents would not recognize their full humanity for generations to come. Consider the weight of that choice. These men were not naive about what they were fighting for. They understood, with total clarity, the distance between the ideals being declared and the reality being lived. And many of them fought anyway, for the practical promise of their own freedom, for the freedom of their families, and in some cases, for a belief in what the nation could become even when it refused to become that for them. Peter Salem was one of these men. Born enslaved in Massachusetts, he fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775. Accounts from the battle credit him with shooting British Major John Pitcairn, a moment that became part of the battle's most retold history. Yet for generations, popular illustrations and accounts of Bunker Hill quietly removed him from the scene entirely. He was there, he fired the shot, and he was edited out of the story for over a century. Salem Poor fought in that same battle, and what happened to his story afterward is one of the most remarkable and least-known documents in Revolutionary War history. 14 American officers, men with no obligation to do so in a colonial society that did not require it of them, signed a formal written commendation to the Massachusetts General Court praising Poor's bravery at Bunker Hill in specific, glowing terms. The document survives today. It describes him as having behaved like an experienced officer, as well as an experienced soldier. 14 white officers chose to put their names on paper specifically to ensure a black soldier's valor would be recorded for history. That document is real. It is preserved. And for most of American history, almost nobody outside specialized historical circles has ever heard of it. James Armistead was enslaved in Virginia when he volunteered to serve under the Marquis de Lafayette as a spy. He infiltrated British camps, posing as a runaway seeking British protection, and fed false information back to British command while gathering real intelligence for the Continental Army. The intelligence he gathered directly informed the troop movements that led to the decisive American victory at Yorktown, the battle that effectively ended the war. After the war, Armistead was not automatically freed for this service. Virginia law required a special legislative petition for his manumission. Lafayette personally wrote a testimonial on his behalf, describing his service in detail. Armistead used that testimonial to secure his freedom in 1787. 4 years after the war he helped win had already ended. He later took the name James Armistead Lafayette, in honor of the man whose testimony helped him win back what should never have been taken from him in the first place. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment stands as one of the most significant and least discussed military units of the entire war. a regiment composed largely of black and Native American soldiers, many of whom enlisted directly from slavery in exchange for a legislative promise of freedom. The regiment fought with distinction throughout the war, including at the Battle of Rhode Island in 1778, where their disciplined defense became a respected part of the unit's military record. Here is the part of this story that requires honesty rather than celebration alone. The Declaration of Independence, signed in 1776, declared that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. The men who wrote and signed it knew, with full awareness, that enslaved black men were fighting in the war being fought to secure those very rights, and that the document's language would not apply to those men or their families. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate and conscious contradiction, built into the foundation of the nation from its first sentence. Slavery continued in the United States for 89 more years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. Black soldiers who fought, bled, and died for American independence returned home, in many cases, to find that the nation they had helped birth had no intention of extending its founding promise to them or to their children. And yet they fought. And their service is documented, preserved, and real, even when the popular memory of the Revolution has spent 2.5 centuries finding ways to leave them out of the picture. This July 4th, the full truth is not a contradiction to be resolved. It is a fact to be held in both hands at once. Crispus Attucks died for a freedom that was, at that exact moment in history, not yet extended to him. Peter Salem fired the shot that history tried to erase him from. Salem Poor's bravery was written down by 14 men who refused to let it disappear, even in a world that wanted it to. James Armistead spied behind enemy lines for a freedom he then had to fight for again, on paper, after the shooting had already stopped. Your ancestors were there from the very first shot fired in Boston to the final victory at Yorktown. They were there before the nation had a name, and they kept showing up for an idea of freedom that did not yet have room for them, because they understood something the document itself had not yet caught up to, that the promise was real, even when the practice was not, and that the only way to make a country honor a promise is to never stop standing inside of it and demanding that it be kept. They were not waiting for permission to belong to this country's founding story. They were already in it, from the very first shot.